In the last few sessions, we've been exploring what I call the metaphysics of storytelling, and I'd like to summarize the path we have taken and look more deeply into what is meant by metaphysics of storytelling. So let's begin with the usual starting place for stories, which is looking at it as a way of knowing or a way of communicating. In ancient Greek philosophy, this would be a subject of epistemology, how we know, and rhetoric, one of the ways that we communicate. But I want to take it a step further because in our time, we tend to think of communication studies, communication effectiveness, how to meaningfully, convincingly rise above all the noise, the background noise in our culture in order to communicate with another person. Tends to be psychological as well as a look at what we have learned about the nature of communications. Now, when one creates a story for the telling, whether it's a story from mythology or whether it's a story from personal life or a story from culture or an event in history or a piece of literary storytelling, when we work with those materials and to embed them in us so that they become our own and that we can communicate them effectively, we also have to ask ourselves, how do we structure this story? Because the structuring of the story is not really visible to one who views the story, or to put it another way, the structure cannot really be heard explicitly by the listener, but the structure does shape the hearing of the listener, and that is the responsibility of the teller. So we're going to move away from terms like rhetoric and epistemology, which we don't use in everyday life anyway, and we're going to take another term which we don't use in everyday life in our culture, and that's metaphysics, or even beyond that, metaphysics and ontology. Metaphysics is the question of what is. What is the nature of reality? And ontology is what is the nature of the beings who inhabit this world, this real world. And of course, in our time, the dilemma is that our culture is not one that is sensitive to metaphysics. In contemporary philosophy, and also the trickle down into all other areas of culture, sociology, humanities, psychology, popular culture, political culture. The whole cultural milieu of our time is one that is not very favorable towards metaphysics. Indeed, a lot of philosophers don't even consider it valid. They think that one cannot really grasp what the real world is out there. That the real world out there is really a construction of our mind, and they'll say our reason. And therefore, we only know the reality out there because we've constructed it. And so, in a sense, we can never really know reality. We're always subjective. We're always very, very subjective. In the West, it was Immanuel Kant who really raised this issue, this philosophical issue, to awareness. And since then, our culture, our Enlightenment, modern, postmodern culture, has taken this even steps further. And we come to an extreme subjectivism, bordering sometimes on even not just subjectivism, but more negatively a sense of nihilism, that we cannot break out of the boundaries of our own existence. So I'm going to make a shift here. This is the end of the philosophy. going to make a shift towards what one storyteller has described, and I think it's a very valid way of looking at the nature of stories and the worlds we create in stories. I mentioned this in an earlier video, and that is that J.R.R. Tolkien, in one of his really brilliant essays, written early, before he wrote the Ring trilogy, speaks about our work as storytellers as being sub-creators. And of course, you could extend this not only into the realm of verbal arts, but in any of the creative arts that we are engaged in. Whether we are dancers or painters or architects or writers or poets or chefs and cooks, we're all in some way creating worlds that reflect the real world out there. The metaphysics that I might say, I'm speaking out of traditional Western tradition, and I might say that the metaphysics of the world is dependent on the mind, the logos, the intellect, the intuitive nature of God. So Tolkien says, well, do we simply react to this? We are the people of the divine world. We are what the gods or God imagines. And all this is a huge, huge script generated by this divine intellect, this logos, or there are other words that you could use, but this name, this holy name that is really beyond our understanding, because we are created by that. We are creatures, and that one is the creator. You can see why this is not very popular in the postmodern world, this kind of approach. So what do? We do two things, and we normally only think that we do one thing, that we inhabit, we live in this world. If we are moral, if we attempt to lead a good life, we try to be respectful of the world that has been dreamed by divinity, and do the right things, etc. If we're not, then we can be destructive of ourselves, but that's another area. But there's another area. It's a second way of looking at this. We can participate in this process of creation. And when we participate in the process of creation, we are, as Tolkien puts it, sub-creators. In other words, we're not independent. We don't make parallel universes on par with the universe made by the creator. But within that universe, we don't know what's beyond the universe, but within this universe, we can also, since we are in the image and likeness of the creator, we can be creators too, but of a certain kind, and that is that we are sub-creators. In other words, I want to take this back into storytelling. You could do this with other art forms. I'm also an iconographer, and we can use the paintings of the Eastern churches as another way of exploring this. But for here, I want to just stay with storytelling. So when we create a world based on our imagination, based on our intuitive part, our intellect, our reason also, but reason is only one part of our spirit and our mind, and overrated in many aspects, both in traditional societies, Western societies, Greek, Roman, medieval, and certainly overrated in modern philosophy, with the absolute belief in the supremacy of reason and logic, and out of that, technology and social control and so forth. So in our mind's eye, using the gift that we have received from the Creator, we can not only communicate this world that has been given to us, that we have been inserted into in the process of creation. We are not merely descriptive people. We are not only people who use our communication skills and our knowing skills, our rhetoric and our epistemology, in order to take the materials of the world and to communicate them verbally as storytellers. So the normal emphasis on us as storytellers is that we're very concerned about how our listeners hear us, and we want to communicate well, and we want to be sure that we understand the world out there and the world in here well enough to communicate in a story. So where's this all going? It's going to a final, I think, insight that Tolkien provides for us as storytellers. And that is, when we are involved in this creative process of storytelling, and the creative process of storytelling is ultimately, I think, an intuitive process. It is a nonverbal process initially, though it becomes verbal very quickly, and it happens in our imagination, in a kind of a dream world, a waking dream. And in that world, when we begin to structure a story, drawing on the materials of primary creation of God's world, but now focused through our creative process. So we have God's world and we have our creative process in which we are in the image and likeness of God. You know, in the Eastern churches, which I am a part of, there is a saying that one returns to again and again, and that is it's usually attributed to Athanasius, one of the early Greek church fathers. And it is that God became human so that humans could become God. The process is called theosis. And I want to suggest that that process of theosis is very, very much a part of the art, the craft, the spiritual discipline of storytelling. So we take a world that we are immersed in, that we are a part of, and we use the process that has been given us as God's creatures to use our imagination to create another world. To create a world. The world within the story is another world. It is an autonomous world. It does not exist in the world around us. Though the images are drawn from there, the feelings are drawn from there, characters may be drawn from there, but it is another reality. So this is what Coleridge is speaking about as a poet when he says we must have the process is the willing suspension of disbelief. You see, our reason, the rational part of us, so dominant in this technological society, says if we cannot reason it out, it doesn't exist. And therefore, our entry into the world of stories is always shaded, covered, colored, and unfortunately distorted by reasoning's ability applying the laws of this world to this interior world of the story. So in the story, we are creating a structure in our mind. Mind is more than just thinking, connected with our whole intuitive being, our insight, our dreaming, our deep emotions, the mind and the heart. We create a world in which there is a metaphysic, and there's a real world. It's a real world, and the way the world is structured metaphysically, according to the basics of metaphysics in narrative, is the kind of world that we will then communicate verbally, finding the words that will give us a glimpse into what we see in the mind's eye. So this process of metaphysics, there are many cultures that have metaphysics. The Greeks and the Romans, medieval scholasticism, and metaphysics has different kinds of categories, essence and existence, substance and accident, all kinds of different categories depending on the kinds of reasoning you want to use, whether it's from Western philosophy or Hindu philosophy or whatever. So in the world of stories, we have basic metaphysical structures. And those are the three structures that I used in the previous videos. There may be more. They may be finessed and understood in a more deep and profound way. But those structures are the journey, and the structures are conflict, and the structure is chaos leading to creation. And when we create a story, we are always going to use this metaphysical background in our mind's eye in order to structure the story. And this is the most important part of this if you were a teller, because the details of your narrative, the time you spend on each section of the narrative, how you spin the story, how you improvise on the story, will depend on your metaphysics. And that metaphysics, of course, can be very rigid and singular so that you always stick to a certain kind of metaphysics, or it can be a much broader and more flexible kind of metaphysics. So most of philosophy in the West has been fixed on a very solid and unchanging metaphysics, going way back to Parmenides and the early pre-Socratic philosophers. I have a tendency to have much more respect for the other approach in the West, which is Heraclitus, and Heraclitus the Obscure, as he's sometimes called, who said things, whose fragments, who's never created a whole system, but a lot of aphorisms and fragments, and makes them very, very mysterious. But he's onto something, and he says, among other things, you never can step into the same river more than once. The river changes. That's only one of his many, many insights. So the world of metaphysics can also be a very flexible world of metaphysics. And the other place to find that is in the wisdom of the East, especially the Buddhist tradition, the Zen tradition, and the Taoist traditions in China, where there's the sense of always things changing, becoming their opposites, the coincidence of opposites, the complementary nature of masculine, feminine, yin, yang, and so forth. We think that's kind of crazy new age stuff that's been generated out of California for the last 50 years. And there is a lot of that fluff, but there's also real substance to this, real substance. So when you tell a story, think about that. What is the metaphysical basis of any story that you tell? Do you see the world essentially as a journey through time, very important dimension of narrative? Do you see the structure of the world in terms of opposition and conflict and transformation and new conflict and resolution and that kind of, is that the world that you see? Or do you see a world that is falling apart and is reborn and falls apart and is reborn? Or do you see all three possibilities and maybe other possibilities as well? So that when you make a decision to tell any story, your listener will never know this, but it will affect the way they hear the story. When you make a decision, your decision will, in a very important way, shape the story. And if you're telling the same story as a journeying tale, or as a conflict tale, or as a creation tale, it'll have a different feel to it. I tried to give some examples in the past videos of how that might be done with the same story. And yes, some stories tend more towards one and other stories tend more towards the other. But even having said that, that's because we choose to inhabit this metaphysical space according to our own interest and our own comfort. So explore the ways. Take a story that you normally tell, maybe you've told many times, and try to restructure it metaphysically, which will basically be a restructuring in your own being. And then as you create the story, you'll find that there is, as you imagine the story in your mind's eye, you'll find that you are seeing that reality in a slightly different way. And that you're seeing what you told as based on a certain kind of metaphysics, let's say the journeying story. It's the easiest for us to tell. Very, very easy for us. Now, that's why we love those stories. Joseph Campbell has an edge over the others in that he has presented us with the most obvious methodology. But if you look at the other methodologies and you decide to explore them, to take a story that you've always seen as maybe a journeying story and say, well, maybe this story has much more conflict in it, much more tension in it than I am willing to put into it up until now. What happens if I start reimagining the story in a different way? So going back to Christian tradition, you have four Gospels, as an example. This is just a metaphor. This is not a one-to-one correspondence, but each of the Gospel writers, or the tradition that gave rise to each of those four Gospels, is kind of based on not only a different audience, not only a different time, not only a different set of concerns to the authors, but it's also based very, very profoundly on different ways of seeing the world, of seeing the gospel, of seeing the good news. And if you go to Eastern traditions, you'll find the same thing. There are many ways of interpreting Buddhist tradition. And the narrations, the stories that are told from that tradition will be very different one from another based on some things that we normally don't consider, and that is the underpinning, the metaphysical underpinning. So I'm going to end this. This is the end of this particular series on the metaphysics of storytelling, and I invite you to always step back with a favorite story and say, what have I created here? What is the metaphysical ground of this story? And what happens if I shift it a bit? How will the story then be retold by me? How will it change? How will it change me? How will it change my listeners? I'm Bob Wilhelm. I'm a teacher, I'm a storyteller, and the next videos will be exploring some new topics, usually a few videos on a single topic to explore it as fully as possible. I hope you can come back and join me. Love to hear from you. Let me know your thoughts on any aspect of this, and please be in touch with me and let me know your take on storytelling.